I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
Hello and welcome to We Need to Talk About on GB News with me, Alex Phillips, where we get stuck into the issues that we really should be looking at in depth. Nothing is off the table and nobody will be cancelled for saying what they think. Keeping me company today is political commentator Patrick O'Flynn. And here's what we've got coming up on the show. After Sue Gray's report into Downing Street parties found a failure of leadership at Number 10, can Boris Johnson stay in his job? The PM is taking flights today and leaving his domestic troubles behind to visit Ukraine amid fears of a possible invasion. And an explosive new report finds extensive failures in the way child exploitation is tackled. Does Britain have a problem when it comes to the abuse of minors? That's what we're talking about for the next hour, but what do you need to talk about? Email gbviews@gbnews.uk, or of course you can tweet us at gbnews. First, it's time for the GB News headlines with Rosie.
Good afternoon, it's just 1 minute past 2 o'clock. I'm Rosie Wright to keep you up to date here on GB News. The Prime Minister is meeting President Volodymyr Zelensky in Ukraine to try to find a diplomatic solution to the tensions with Russia. A call with Russia's President Vladimir Putin, which was due to be held yesterday, has now been rescheduled for tomorrow afternoon. Samantha de Burden from the Institute of International Affairs says there's still hope for a peaceful resolution.
Diplomacy is continuing. So that is always a good sign. And you have to remember that Putin actually has a lot to lose. And I think that the plans that Liz Truss unveiled yesterday to say that Russian oligarchs in Putin's close circle will be targeted have shown a very, very strong resolve to explain to Putin that the consequences for him personally could be rather dramatic.
Meanwhile, there have been renewed calls for Boris Johnson's resignation, despite his pledge to overhaul how he runs government. The Prime Minister apologised yesterday after the Sue Gray report into alleged Downing Street parties found failures of leadership and judgment. Boris Johnson says an updated version of the inquiry will be published after the police investigation is complete. Well, Conservative MP Andrew Bridgen told GB News the buck stops with Boris Johnson.
We've got a concession from the Prime Minister that he will release the Sue Gray report unredacted in full. All we've seen is 12 pages of filleted report, but that was actually damning enough. Serious misjudgments and leadership across Number 10 and the Cabinet Office, widening the blame, never mentioning the Prime Minister, but ultimately he sets the culture in Number 10 and the government.
Meanwhile, Conservative MP David Davis is repeatedly calling for Boris Johnson to step down.
Having seen 3 leaderships fall in the Tory party, this would take forever. They all were a death of 1,000 cuts. It was incredibly corrosive. I mean, John Major, for example, we ended up with the worst result in a century, virtually. Theresa May, the agony of the last 2 years. And I don't want to see our country or my party or actually even Boris go through that.
Downing Street says the Prime Minister stands by his comments in the Commons yesterday about Sir Keir Starmer's record as a prosecutor. The Labour leader says claims he failed to prosecute the notorious sex offender are false. Sir Keir was Director of Public Prosecutions at the time, but he was not involved directly in the case. The House of Commons Speaker says he's far from satisfied that the Prime Minister's comments were appropriate. Around 1,600 Tesco staff are facing redundancy. The supermarket's chain is going to stop replenishing stock overnight at dozens of stores, and some of its petrol stations will no longer be staffed out of hours. Tesco's also closing its Jack's discount shops, saying it wants to focus on its core business. National Highways will not face corporate manslaughter charges over 2 fatal crashes on a smart motorway. Police have announced they won't be taking action after investigating the deaths of 3 people on the M1 last year. It's after a coroner concluded there was an ongoing risk of future deaths on motorways without a clear hard shoulder. The Met Police says it's deeply sorry for the appalling conduct of one of its team after a watchdog found evidence of bullying, racism and misogyny within its ranks. The Independent Office for Police Conduct investigated 14 officers at Charing Cross Police Station. 2 were dismissed for gross misconduct, 2 quit, and several others faced disciplinary action. The IOPC says the issues are not isolated to the one team and that the Met needs to rebuild public trust and confidence. More than 1 in 10 children are starting school in England without having had their measles, mumps and rubella jab. Take-up of the vaccine is at its lowest rate in a decade. The World Health Organization says 95% of children need to be vaccinated to keep measles at bay. But the current coverage for the 2 doses of the MMR jab is around 85%. Dr. Sarah Kayat says even a small drop in vaccine uptake can cause problems.
We know that even small insults in that level can result in outbreaks on a population level. And I think with COVID restrictions coming down, travel becoming more popular again, we have to remember that there may be travel from more endemic areas where measles is more endemic, and that will mean outbreaks will start happening.
The online word game Wordle has been sold to the New York Times. It's been a hugely successful online puzzle. It went for an undisclosed sum in the low 7 figures. Its creator says the word game's popularity became overwhelming to run. The US newspaper has hinted it may not remain free to play in the future. You are up to date now on GB News. I'll bring you more as it happens. Now let's go to We Need to Talk About and Alex.
A stay of execution. Those are the murmurings in Westminster today as the Prime Minister leaves the pressure cooker environment of his own party to face down tensions abroad. Having suffered a pummelling in the Commons from opposition benches as well as his own, with Theresa May stabbing Boris in the front in a meme-worthy moment, the Prime Minister convened a meeting of MPs where he laid out his mea culpa and set out a programme to rebuild public favour with a slate of Brexity goodness. Brexity goodness that's been rather eclipsed by the vengeful media drip feed from his former kingmakers, who styled Boris as the Brexit saviour he now really needs to become. Big policy drops yesterday on free ports and a cutting of £1 billion of EU red tape were clearly a clumsy attempt to distract from the chaos, with headlines of sunlit uplands perhaps better placed when the skies aren't so Sue Gray. But perhaps Partygate will prove a seminal moment for Boris, and with COVID behind him, the Prime Minister will be propelled to focus on building a legacy that isn't only a teetering tower of tinnies in the corner of number 10. Well, let's start with a recap of what happened yesterday with the publication of Sue Gray's report. Our Home and Security Affairs editor, Mark White, has sent us this overview.
It is an image that drew widespread condemnation well before the publication of Sue Gray's report. Anger at the sight of the Prime Minister, alongside his wife and other number 10 staff, enjoying cheese and wine in the Downing Street garden, while the rest of the nation endured COVID lockdown. This gathering, and more than a dozen others in possible breach of COVID laws, have plunged Boris Johnson's government into weeks of crisis. The official Cabinet Office report into the culture that allowed these events is damning. With a Scotland Yard investigation underway, Sue Gray could only deliver partial conclusions, but they still make deeply uncomfortable reading for the Prime Minister and his team. She found at least some of the gatherings in question represent a serious failure to observe not just the high standards expected of those working at the heart of government, but also of the standards expected of the entire British population at the time. There were, she said, failures of leadership and judgment by different parts of Number 10 and the Cabinet Office at different times. In the Commons, the Prime Minister was contrite.
I want to say sorry. And I'm sorry for the things we simply didn't get right, and also sorry for the way that this matter has been handled. And it's no use saying that this or that was within the rules, and it's no use saying that people were working hard. This pandemic was hard for everyone.
The senior civil servant took particular aim at the lack of leadership throughout Downing Street that allowed for clearly inappropriate behaviour, even in the midst of a global pandemic. Sue Gray's report said at times it seems there was too little thought given to what was happening across the country in considering the appropriateness of some of these gatherings, the risks they presented to public health, and how they might appear to the public.
Prime Minister, the British public aren't fools. They never believed a word of it. They think the Prime Minister should do the decent thing and resign.
There is considerable anger within political circles that this report has been severely restricted in its initial scope because of the official police investigation into a number of the Downing Street parties and a request from Scotland Yard not to prejudice their ongoing investigation.
So we've just received that, and my officers are prioritising this week to consider what's been provided in that bundle of material, what further investigations that they need to do, and of course who they're going to be contacted. But at the moment, no, I do not know exactly who will be contacted.
The Prime Minister's critics say they fear he's been able to kick the Partygate fallout into the long grass, with so far no commitment to publish the second part of Sue Gray's report in full. In truth, though, this only prolongs his protracted discomfort as political opponents and the media refuse to move on from a row that continues to seriously damage his premiership. Mark White, GB News.
Well, I'm delighted to be joined by veteran political commentator Patrick O'Flynn. What do you think of this? Do you think he has managed to kick this into the long grass, or is this just basically a slow dance with death?
Well, my position throughout this has been that the time the Tory party will decide who leads it into the next election, the best time is about a year from now. If Boris Johnson hasn't managed to turn things round, and that looks increasingly difficult, then they will ruthlessly ditch him, including most of the people who are kind of passionately standing up for him now. But I do think it looks like he's earned himself that year, but with cost of living crisis, channel migration shambles, it doesn't look like he's got a grip of either of those. The odds are he's not going to turn it around. And then there's one other proviso. I think the Partygate thing, whether it's immediately terminal for him, may all hinge on this November the 13th party that actually took place in his own flat. Now, it might have begun as a meeting with some special advisors who were also friends of Carrie Symonds, as was then, and then if it did turn into a party with booze, with dancing, ABBA, winner takes it all, and he knew about it and it went on. Potentially he's in the remit of getting a fixed penalty notice himself. I would have thought she might be in danger of it too. I think if we got to that stage and the idea of misleading the House of Commons becomes that much more compelling, if it got to that, then I think they might pull the trapdoor on him before then. But otherwise, it makes sense for everyone to have a look at where we are early 2023 to get a successor in for a honeymoon general election. So there is a bit to play for, but at the moment there's not much sign of there being enough people around Boris Johnson who are really going to focus him on the big issues that his 2019 voters put him in to sort out.
I mean, it's interesting yesterday, there seemed to be a desperate scramble from the number 10 spin machine to push out basically red meat to red wall voters. These big headlines of cutting EU red tape, £1 billion worth potentially to be saved, and talking about establishing free ports. He went to Tilbury Docks to talk about the benefits of those. And yet it hasn't really had the effect of distracting from the party. But does it suggest that because Boris now really does need to show to everybody what the Johnson legacy is going to be, he might actually knuckle down and start behaving like a Prime Minister with conviction?
He might do, and he obviously has Michael Gove, whatever you think of him, who is a very forensic mind and people say the best implementer in the cabinet, in charge now of pulling the strands of levelling up together. There were announcements yesterday about, Wolverhampton and Sheffield getting some early investment, and perhaps Gove can really produce a kind of a feeling that that agenda is being driven properly, and Boris Johnson needs to drive the post-Brexit agenda properly. And the real touchstone issue for his 2019 voters, I think, is quote, taking control of borders. Now, he claimed in his sort of triumphalist piece in one of the newspapers, the Daily Mail, I think, to have done that with Brexit. But no one who looks at what's happening in the Channel could possibly think anyone could fairly say Britain's taken back control of its borders. It hasn't. 6 times as many crossings this January as last January. It's going in the wrong direction. The Prime Minister has never squared with the British people what his plan is to deal with that. So there's a feeling of drift, and he gets involved in the issues that the person around him who he listens to most likes. And last year, second half of the year, it was all net zero and animal rights, fine. But that's not what the core Boris Johnson electorate of 2019 wants to hear about.
No, indeed. Thank you, Patrick. Well, as we try and figure out what it is that Boris does plan to do as Prime Minister, we can find out about all the things he potentially said he didn't do. Here are some of the main points from the Sue Gray report. She said some behaviour was difficult to justify and there was a serious failure to observe high standards expected. She noted failures of leadership in Number 10 and the Cabinet Office, and pointed out that some staff felt unable to raise concerns. Sue Gray also said in the report at least some of the gatherings in question represent a serious failure to observe not just the high standards expected of those working at the heart of government, but also of the standards expected of the entire British population at the time. Well, I'm joined now by Fabian Hamilton, Labour MP for Leeds North East. Fabian, thank you for coming and joining me in the studio. I mean, your leader gave a very brilliant speech, possibly one of his best yesterday, and I think really sort of exhibited the dichotomy between goings-on in Downing Street and the way people were behaving. But it doesn't seem to have done the trick. I mean, the Tory MPs are sticking by him. Boris lives to fight another day. What is going to topple him from power?
Well, I mean, that's what they want us to think. But actually, I think there's deep unease even amongst the Tory ranks in Parliament. Privately, a lot of Tory MPs are saying, well, I'm not going to break ranks because I don't want to be picked off. But they're very, very uncomfortable. And if you saw the faces yesterday in the House of Commons while he was speaking, especially when he made some comments about the Labour leader, then you could see for yourself, actually, that they're not happy. They're not happy at all. And you're right, Starmer's speech was excellent because he was angry, he was fired up, and he's angry on behalf not just of the Labour Party, but of the millions of people who abided by the rules when Downing Street flouted them.
But the problem, I suppose, that the Labour Party has now is that Boris Johnson, as Prime Minister, can knuckle down and stop behaving like a statesman. He's over in Ukraine today. He's setting forth a Brexit bill to cut red tape, which should appeal to some of the core voters. Yet we're not really sure what it is the Labour Party stands for at the moment. The counter-offer isn't there. They seem to be able to attack the Prime Minister when he's really got his back against the ropes, but it's not always clear what it is that they're proposing.
Well, you say that, Alex, but actually we stand firmly with the taxpayer. At this very moment, there's a debate going on about the £4.3 billion in fraudulent claims during lockdown that's been written off by the Treasury. This is absolutely shocking and appalling. So we stand up for the taxpayer, we stand up for decent public services, properly funded, we stand up for the people who are struggling with the cost of living at the moment. The government says it's going to address the cost of living. The Prime Minister mentions it all the time, and yet he is responsible for this hike in the cost of living. If you look at energy prices, they've gone up worldwide, but far less so in the rest of Europe than in the United Kingdom. If you look at the other costs of living, for example, the increase in national insurance contributions, that's going to badly affect so many of the poorest households. And of course, prices of food and other living costs going up and up and up, and yet wages and salaries are staying the same or going down.
So do you rather think, as people's experiences of what it's going to be like in 2022 when the energy price cap is removed, when that tax hike comes into play, when they're looking at the Prime Minister's legacy and finding it wanting, do you think that's going to...
The public's made its mind up. I think this is a moment like 30 years ago when the Tories scraped through the general election of 1992, only 3 months later, to pull out of the exchange rate mechanism and damage their reputation for financial competence for many, many years. This is a moment like that. I don't think the cabal around Boris Johnson understands the damage they've done to people's confidence, not just in his leadership, actually in our parliamentary process, but more importantly, I think in the whole of the Conservative Party. And that will stay with people for a long, long time. It's going to be very hard to win that back. It's all very well saying, oh, it's just Boris, we know what he's like. But the very things that attracted many of the public, especially in the red wall seats, to Boris Johnson's Conservative Party and his leadership are the very things that repulse people most right now.
We have, of course, got a bit of a litmus coming up in May with some local elections, a large amount of those in metropolitan areas, which tend to often go in Labour's favour. If you do not make big gains in those elections, will you be looking back at your own party and saying, why are we not, when we've got this headway, when we've got the Prime Minister in a weak position, why are we not gaining as much as we could?
Well, let's wait and see what the outcome of the elections is. I mean, the people of this country, it's the biggest test to date of the damage that this whole party scandal, a lockdown scandal, the immorality, if you like, of the Prime Minister and his cabal, it's going to be the first big electoral test. Let's wait and see what the outcome is. What I'm getting on the doorstep so far, and we've started our canvassing in my constituency in Leeds, is that people are really, really angry, and they're still angry. They don't care what Sue Gray says. What they want is a government that has moral values and that actually stands by the people that it's elected to represent, that stands up for the most oppressed and the poorest in our society, that stands for equality, justice and fairness. And that's not what they're getting. So let's wait and see what the outcome is. I expect them to be very, very good, frankly.
Fabian, thank you so much for coming and joining me in the studio. It's been a pleasure having you here.
Thank you.
Well, there we go. Wait and see. There's a lot of waiting and seeing, isn't there? Grey report, we waited for that and we didn't get to see much. Now we're waiting for the Met Police report. You're with GB News on TV and DAB radio. It's time for a short break now and a check on the weather forecast. I'll be back soon.
Hi there. A bright but windy day in the far north with showers for northern Scotland. Cloudier further south with some outbreaks of generally light rain and drizzle associated with this cold front as it clears south. And it's in between this cold front and the warm front there across southern parts of the UK where we've got a lot of cloud and some outbreaks of light rain and drizzle. But to the north, brighter skies, tight isobars there across the far north of Scotland. So for the likes of Caithness, Sutherland, Orkney, 55 to 65 mile per hour wind gusts. So wind warning in force because of weakened structures. Could be some further impacts following the storms at the weekend. Otherwise, a breezy day to come for northern parts of the UK, some sunny spells, a few showers in the far north of Scotland, much cloudier further south where it will be mild at 11 or 12 Celsius. We keep the cloud across southern areas overnight. In fact, there'll be thicker cloud pushing in from the west as the night goes on, some more persistent rain into Northern Ireland for a time, western parts of northern England, as well as western and southern Scotland. Showers continue across the Northern Isles, and for Shetland, they'll be falling as sleet and snow overnight. But further south, drier with some breaks in the cloud. However, for the vast majority, it is a mild night. That is away from Shetland, where it will be cold. Cold air continues there for Shetland as we start off tomorrow, but otherwise a lot of the cloud across the UK remains. Further outbreaks of light rain and drizzle for Northern Ireland, western Scotland, as well as parts of northwest England. But drier and brighter further south. Some sunshine coming through, and with a lighter breeze, it will feel fairly pleasant in that sunshine. Temperatures above average, 10 to 12 Celsius for the vast majority. Into Wednesday evening, and we'll see the outbreaks of light rain and drizzle become heavier and more persistent across the north and northwest of Scotland, staying damp for northern parts of the UK through the night, but drier further south, a lot of cloud cover, so a mild start once again on Thursday. Again, it's going to be damp in the north and west on Thursday, brighter skies follow on Friday.
Hello there, I'm Eamon.
And I'm Isabel.
And you're watching the GB News digital stream across the United Kingdom.
And around the world.
If you're here in the UK, you can also watch us on your TV screen. GB News is Freeview channel 236.
On Sky, we're channel 515.
626 on Virgin Media.
Just remember, you might need to retune your TV to watch the channel.
Yeah, and if you are doing that, find out more about retuning by going to gbnews.uk.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon.
And Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
As Boris Johnson arrives in the Ukrainian capital Kiev, checkbook open and ready to help against mounting Russian threats, will the sudden statesmanship have effective cut-through on, frankly, a sociopathic socialist hell-bent on avenging the dissolution of his Soviet past? With the EU driving a coach and horses through any consolidated European efforts to dissuade Putin from imperial games, frankly due to shameful German acquiescence to the Kremlin over gas, it seems it will be down to a transatlantic partnership to call Putin's bluff. But without fair weather friends France and Germany, what can the UK do to stand up against Russian aggression? Joining me on the show now is former senior military intelligence officer Philip Ingram Mbe. Philip, how do you read this situation? I mean, Putin, it's just been announced as cancelled. That phone conversation with Boris, that's now pushed back till tomorrow. Are we just going to be rattling his cage and inviting reprisals in the UK? Or do you think that some of the plans laid out today, such as sanctions going after the oligarchs, going after Russian banking systems and preventing exports, is that going to make Putin think again?
It's the one tool that will make Putin think again. You know, his position is underpinned by all the oligarchs that are supporting him, and if they get hurt in a way that they don't have their billions to be able to spend the way they want to, then that is a real danger to him. So Putin will have that in the back of his mind. What he's doing with his diplomatic efforts at the moment is he's playing the international community. He's playing it extremely well so that he can get a message out to the international community that he has cooperated, but the international community has failed to live up to his reasonable requests. None of them are reasonable, but he's also playing it to his domestic audience so that he can say to his domestic audience, he's tried to be conciliatory to the West, but the West haven't given in and they're just aggressive and they want to attack Russia and threaten Russia for the rest of their lives. So he has to do something about it. And he's having some real successes. You mentioned Germany, but it's Germany and Hungary are the two countries that have effectively split away from a wider EU support. He's now undermined any hope of the EU coming together in some form of defence pact in the future. He's putting pressure on Ireland with naval exercises 275 miles off the Cork coast, which is an open flank to the EU, and NATO is going to have to look at that. Putin's playing a very, very clever game at the moment.
Yeah, and he seems to know exactly how to divide and conquer. I mean, some of his demands are things such as rolling back NATO and giving a hard and fast guarantee that Ukraine will never join. Clearly, those are things that the West are not going to have any truck with.
Well, exactly, and he knows that. So he's playing an information game. But the information game is aimed at two audiences. There's the international audience, Does he care about it? Not really. He just wants to go through the diplomatic efforts to give him more time to get his preparations in place, to allow him to make a decision. He hasn't made the final decision to go into Ukraine yet, but it's getting closer and closer. But it's working to his domestic audience as well, to try and shore up his image as being this bare-chested, horse-riding leader who will look after Russian interests, because his ultimate goal, he would love to have the old USSR back under his presidency, where he's got Russia as a global power. His military budget is less than the UK's military budget. Combine that as a comparison to the whole of NATO's military budget, it's tiny, but he can still field huge numbers of troops that are out there. So he's testing us at the moment to work out just how far he can go, both diplomatically, politically within that, and then what his military options are. And he's so hedge betting those military options at the moment.
I mean, there are understandably some very twitchy countries near Russia. Poland, for example, have been saying that Germany have loaded Putin's pistol and he's now able to blackmail an entire continent with gas. The problem is he's been playing a long game and we've been allowing him to do it. How many options are we actually left with now? Because, yes, we can go after his oligarchs. Frankly, they've been running riot in London for the best part of 2 decades anyway. We can go after Russian banking, but Germany is uncomfortable with the idea of using the SWIFT system or excluding them from the SWIFT system to do that. So that feels rather toothless. We're talking about blocking exports to try and cripple Russian industry. But the whole time he's got his hands on the gas tap, then he really does have a trump card.
Putin's been playing this for a number of years. Remember, it was 2014 he annexed Crimea. He's playing the long game. And the headlines across all of the news channels today show where the UK's priorities are. Over Borisgate, actually, there's the potential for the third European war, leading to a third world war happening within a couple of weeks. If you take that into longer-term consequences, that should be the #1 story that's hitting everything at the moment, but it's not. So, Putin is absolutely loving this and loving what's going on at the moment and been able to play these political cracks in a different way, because he plays it from a long-term perspective. He plays it from an information perspective, first of all, an influence perspective, and that gives him his military options. And I think he's getting to the point where he's hoping that he can annex another part of Ukraine, probably eastern Ukraine, going a little bit further than Donbass and move his military troops into there, and not the whole of Ukraine. And then the Western view of that will be, everyone will just go, phew, thank goodness he didn't invade the whole of Ukraine. He's only taken a little bit. We'll let him get away with that. And that's what he's trying to balance off at the moment.
Yeah, well, he did set a very dangerous precedent when he took over Crimea, and the international community seemed to just tut. Philip Ingram Mbe, thank you so much for your wisdom and, rather bleak insight there. You're with GB News on TV and DAB radio. Coming up, a new report finds extensive failures in the way child exploitation is tackled. What is going wrong? Now it's time for a check on the news headlines.
Good afternoon, it is 2:32. I'm Rosie Wright to keep you up to date here on GB News. The Prime Minister has arrived in Ukraine to try to de-escalate tensions with Russia. Boris Johnson will speak to President Volodymyr Zelensky about trying to find a diplomatic solution. A call with Russia's President Vladimir Putin, which was due to be held yesterday, has now been rescheduled for tomorrow afternoon. Downing Street has suggested the public may never be told if Boris Johnson is fined for breaching lockdown rules. The Prime Minister apologised after the Sue Gray report into alleged Downing Street parties found failures of leadership and judgment. He says an updated version of the inquiry will be published after the police investigation is completed. Downing Street says the Prime Minister stands by his comments in the Commons yesterday about Sir Keir Starmer's record as a prosecutor. Boris Johnson criticised the Labour leader for failing to prosecute notorious sex offender Jimmy Savile. Labour says the claim is false because Sir Keir wasn't directly involved in the case. The House of Commons Speaker says he's far from satisfied that the Prime Minister's comments were appropriate. Around 1,600 Tesco staff are facing redundancy. The supermarket chain is going to stop replenishing stock overnight at dozens of stores, and some of its petrol stations will no longer be staffed out of hours. Well, Tesco's also closing its Jack's discount shops, saying it wants to focus instead on its core business. More than 1 in 10 children are starting school in England without having had their measles, mumps and rubella jab. Take-up of the vaccine is at its lowest rate in a decade. The World Health Organization says 95% of children need to be vaccinated to keep measles at bay, but the current coverage for 2 doses of the MMR jab is around 85%. You are up to date here on GB News. We're on your TV, online and DAB Plus radio. A short break, then we'll be back to We Need to Talk About with Alex.
Hello there, I'm Eamon.
And I'm Isabel.
And you're watching the GB News digital stream across the United Kingdom.
And around the world.
If you're here in the UK, you can also watch us on your TV screen. GB News is Freeview channel 236.
On Sky, we're channel 515.
626 on Virgin Media.
Just remember, you might need to retune your TV to watch the channel.
Yeah, and if you are doing that, find out more about retuning by going to gbnews.uk.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilized conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
Now, as the woke take to tearing down statues, I often wonder why, rather than decrying the ills of the past centuries ago, nobody is taking the knee for the slew of slaves still in circulation today. As we watched baying crowds in Bristol wearing sweatshop disposable fashion, with nail bar extensions and souped-up beamers fresh from the hand car wash, smoking joints bought from drugs gangs, it seems tragic that the choreography of a global mob to lament inequality aren't minded to decry the exploitation and trafficking evident in every city and town in the present day. Why waste time on real suffering and complex problems when there are statues to shout at, and while black market stuff is so cheap? A new report released today reveals the shocking extent of modern slavery in Britain, with over 10,000 victims, yet only 56 convictions, despite an estimated 6,000 to 8,000 perpetrators. Joining me now to discuss this is Specialist Advisor on Modern Slavery at the Human Trafficking Foundation, Phil Brewer, and Head of Modern Slavery at the Centre for Social Justice, Louise Gleach. Louise, I'm going to start with you. Can you outline for me the report's key findings?
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, this report picks up on some research we did a couple of years ago where we found, based on police data, there's probably actually 100,000 victims, not just the 10,000 who are being identified and coming forward for support. So what we wanted to do this time was look at the situation with support to see how we can help more victims come forward and get support. And what we found really, if you trace the whole journey that a victim takes, there's not enough support at that very early stage when people are first identified in a police operation or they come forward. So many of them, they lose trust. They're unsure, they're confused, they're just really afraid. So many of them don't get anywhere near support in the first place. And then those that do, they're often waiting too long for the Home Office to decide, are they a victim or aren't they a victim? And then they also are not getting the kind of support they need to make a really good recovery and also to have that confidence to engage with the police. So what we're seeing is gaps between the support system and the criminal justice system. But what we know when we did the research is we found that when victims do get really good support, that's when they're best able to cooperate with the police. They have that confidence, and that's when we see more people being convicted.
This is a huge number of people, but what does a modern day slave actually look like? I mean, who are we talking about? Are we talking about things right under our noses, such as nail bars, hand car washes? Are we talking about people treated as domestic slaves and, you know, treated terribly but in the privacy of people's homes? Are we talking about prostitutes? What sort of make up the main numbers of modern day slaves?
You're exactly right, Alex. These are people who are often hidden in plain sight. They're people who are doing our nails in high street nail bars. They're people who are washing your car in the hand car wash just down your high street. There are also people who are hidden more in domestic servitude, and that can range from just your local family down the street to much more wealthier individuals who've brought people over from other countries. We also have a lot of people exploited in sexual exploitation. Many people probably have seen the recent documentary on the BBC the other week. And so we have such a range. But one thing that I think many people are still surprised by is the number of British victims. We're not talking only about people who've been brought here from another country, but about a third of our victims that we are identifying are British nationals.
And are those people involved in things such as drugs trafficking, prostitution, what you'd consider to be sort of the high level of crime?
Exactly. But also some people can be exploited in farms and in labour exploitation. We had a case recently where a man who'd been kept in slavery for 40 years, where he'd been enslaved working in a kind of a construction remit on farms up and down Cumbria.
Well, I now also want to bring in Phil Brewer, who is from the Human Trafficking Foundation. Phil, when you hear of this report with modern-day slaves, that I'm sure that is no surprise to you. When people are being trafficked into slavery to work in the black market, are there particular routes, particular countries that they're coming from?
Yeah, I mean, the report today, the report that Louise has been part of, sadly highlights things that we're already aware of, and that's the real sadness about this. It's not like this is the report opens up new areas that we've not considered. This just highlights things that we've been talking about for many years. And you know, it's as Louise said, this isn't just about people coming from abroad to the UK to be exploited. You know, 50% of people are from the UK. They are British nationals being exploited. But the issue is that what lies underneath are vulnerabilities, whether that's sort of social, financial, the fact that they're part of a community that is more likely to be exploited than others. It could be that they've already got criminal records, and actually there's that fear or worry that if they went to the police, they're not going to be believed anyway. So this is so much more than just people coming to the UK. This is about actually sort of those enablers to exploitation that's part of their life.
Why do you think we're in the situation that we are today, with so many victims and so few convictions, when, as Louise was saying, a lot of this stuff is happening right under our noses? Why has there been such inactivity in actually catching the perpetrators and putting a stop to this vile trade in humans?
The one bit that we seem to really struggle with is having a consistent approach across the UK. You know, the UK is made up of 45 separate police forces. Each of those forces will decide on the area that is a priority for them based on their community's needs. And quite often, from modern slavery, as we always talk about being a hidden crime, in some respects, if you go looking for it, you'll find it. If you don't go looking for it, it may not necessarily be raised as an issue. And I appreciate that won't sit comfortably with everyone, but that unfortunately is a sad fact of where we are. So we end up with a disjointed approach. And some of the work that I've done with the Human Trafficking Foundation, you know, we've also found this scenario where even where we've got similar forces of similar sizes policing similar communities, each of those forces will approach this in a different way. So there is no consistency, even when the issue is very similar in size and sort of mode, so to speak.
Yeah, I'm going to come back to you, Louise, because it was your foundation that put together this report. What do you think now needs to be done? What recommendations are you giving? Do you think there needs to be a dedicated act in Parliament to really take on modern slavery?
Yeah, so the report's really focused on what we can do to support victims better. So we've got 24 recommendations, a lot of them very detailed, but some of the key things are better support, places of safety where victims can go when they first come forward, so that we can establish trust with them without having to ask them, do they want to travel halfway across the country in order to get support? We think we need much more coordination between the police, between charities and local authorities, so that they can work together, so that nobody falls through the gaps and the victims are able to get the support that they need. And that should be based really on the victim's needs and not a checklist of eligibility, whether someone is able to get something or not.
And is there anything that members of the general public can do if they see that I don't know, there's a particular shop or a car wash or whatever it is that they think, I'm not sure if the people here are properly employed. Is there any way that they can report that or whistleblow?
Absolutely. So there's always Crime Stoppers, of course, where you can report anything anonymously. But there's also the Modern Slavery and Exploitation Helpline, which has a website, there's an app, and there's a phone number that people can call just to report their suspicions. Of course, if you see anything that you think someone's actually in danger, you must definitely call the police.
Louise, thank you. And back to you again, Phil. I mean, we've seen over the course of the past year a huge spike in the number of people coming over on makeshift boats and dinghies across the Channel, and many of those end up underneath the wing of the government and being processed and well, to who knows what fate. But there must be a huge proportion of those people who get absorbed into the black market and find their way, you know, perhaps they have been deliberately trafficked to find their way into modern slavery.
No, absolutely right, Alex, and that's a real concern. You know, if you arrive in the UK, you're undocumented. That goes back to what I was talking about earlier on with the enablers. You know, it's an enabler to exploitation. You are under the radar. You're not going to seek help from the authorities because you're concerned that you will then become part of that assessment process to decide whether or not you stay in the UK. So absolutely, you know, although we quite often talk about smuggling and trafficking being two separate crime types, in some ways they're intrinsically linked because one creates vulnerability to the other.
Brewer there. Now I'm going to go back to Patrick O'Flynn, my guest of the day. Patrick, what do you think about this? I mean, it's almost Victorian, isn't it? There's these sorts of the black markets and the way people are being treated. And I know that we used to discuss this as potentially an appendage of EU freedom of movement, which allowed gangs from countries such as Bulgaria, Romania to traffic people into the UK with ease.
I think it's becoming a massive problem. I mean, for instance, people say the hand car wash business. I don't know if many viewers, you know, in the old days we used to go to actually machine car washes, and sort of labour has become so cheap and so unregulated now that I can't help but noticing there's a lot of very miserable looking young men from Southeast Europe seem to be employed on these hand car washes. Are they official labour? Are they getting the minimum wage? Are they being exploited by gang masters? We seem to have a bit of a ruthless global trade in the trafficking of human beings, and lax immigration laws has made that worse. And you know, I do harp on a bit about the Channel migration shambles, but clearly, if people are in hock to people traffickers, they're in a very vulnerable position if they do get through and into Britain to be exploited as a sort of payback for their passage across. So I think much stronger controls, the EU, the Schengen Agreement, which allows people to sort of, once they're in, to kind of move throughout the whole domain and on, in our case, to the shores of northern France, that risks exploitation too. The only slightly cynical rider I would put is can this be used as an excuse prepared in advance occasionally for people who have no right to be in our country to avoid deportation by saying that they're victims of ruthless, dangerous criminals when, you know, that might be hard to prove or disprove either way.
Do you think that the West has almost a cultural complacency about this now? I mean, when I look at some of the big areas where you might expect to find modern slaves, one would be women being trafficked and used in porn videos, and yet the government's not done anything about that for decades. The other is, as you said, things like the hand car washes. We've seen allegations against some of these big online clothing retailers for using sweatshops, and yet their profits have gone through the roof. And they've bought up half of the high street. So why is it when people are spending so much time focusing on slavery of old, so much slavery is happening right under our noses and nothing is being done?
I think the big political parties and the big politics has just lost touch with the idea of community and the idea of people looking out for each other. I do think the sort of hyper-migration we have these days in and out of the country makes it much harder to keep a track on everyone who's in a community, whether they're being exploited, whether they are exploiters. And, you know, again, the big parties seem to be driven very much by those who lobby, perhaps those who donate, who are on a nice number and are making big profits out of some of these dodgy practices. So I think our political class has lost touch with that, and there is room for someone to come in and care a bit more.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Patrick, thank you. Well, two separate incidents have revealed just how disturbingly dystopian the debate over trans rights has become. In Wales, a disabled woman in Newport was arrested for posting stickers saying "no men in women's prisons" and "humans never change sex," something frankly centuries of biology has taught us as unequivocal fact. Her house was raided and a book of essays critiquing radical transgendering was confiscated. Meanwhile, in Scotland, another woman, the founder of Brodie's Trust, a charity supporting women who have lost a baby to domestic violence or forced termination, was interviewed by police for a tweet in which she defended her services being available to women only. It is a truly terrifying, totalitarian example of the rabid thought police and extreme censorship indoctrinating our public services at the highest level and silencing the very women fighting for the protections of the most vulnerable females. Well, joining me now is academic and author Heather Brunskell-Evans. Heather, you were the editor of the book that was confiscated. Tell me a little bit about what happened.
Can I just say that I'm the co-editor. I edited with my colleague, Professor Michelle Moore. So both of us edited it and both of us wrote in it. So the book, ironically, is about safeguarding children. It's generally speaking, it's about the ways in which organisations like Mermaids and Gendered Intelligence have taken the place of Stonewall, educating and providing services to institutions like education and medicine about training. And their argument is that children can be born in the wrong body. So a little boy with a penis could, in fact, be a girl inside, and so on. So this ideology is being taken into schools and into medical practices. And the book warned against this. In particular, it was concerned with the supposed transition that was going on in the Tavistock, the hospital in the UK, who deals with alleged transitioning of children to the other sex. It warned of the dangers of that physically, and also that children, we argued, can't consent to such medical practices, although, of course, what people do when they're adults is a different matter. So the book was about safeguarding children.
And are you surprised that this book has now been confiscated as if it's full of hateful, insightful material designed to attack the trans community? Because it seems to me that it's really not.
I wish I were surprised. I'm no longer surprised. I've been involved in this debate now for a number of years, and quite honestly, it's all too easy to This is somewhat typical, actually. The book itself, the Tavistock, there are two books, in fact, and about children. And the Tavistock itself attempted to stop the second one from being published. So Professor Moore and myself have been in the eye of the storm about this, attempting to protect children and trying to flag up to society in general that these terrible things are actually happening. So I wasn't surprised that the police took it away, and I wasn't surprised that the police are involved in what I call a suppression of open debate, because I know that they are. So in relation to this particular incident in Wales, I mean, it was shocking in itself. I'd like to talk about it outside of the book now. And what happened to a woman who is disabled, who was imprisoned in a cell, I mean, for over 10 hours, deprived of her medicine, was put into a police van on her back to be taken to the police station. I mean, the indignity of it, the absolute indignity of it. And then later allowed to leave the police station at 3 o'clock in the morning on her mobility scooter to drive back home in the cold and dark, in a very unsafe place in the town in which she lived. So the police are completely overreaching their authority, absolutely completely overreaching.
It's terrifying.
And on the
It's absolutely terrifying. Thank you so much for coming and talking to us today, and keep up your very brave work. Well, Patrick, we haven't got long, but what are your views on this, very succinctly?
Well, there are two aspects. The child protection aspect's obviously very delicate, very sensitive, very worrying. The other thing is just basically women are entitled to protected spaces, and yet somehow we have a Conservative government that seems to be hand in glove with pressure groups like Stonewall, and Boris Johnson turned up to one of their fringe events at the Tory conference where Carrie Johnson was speaking, who are imposing, as far as I can see, a militant trans agenda that feminists are not allowed to complain about, to debate, to test. And I think that's crackers. And I think the vast majority of the British public can see in places like domestic refuges, in prisons, in sports changing rooms, in sport, you know, women deserve protected spaces, biological women, and it should not be a problem or wrong to make that case.
Couldn't agree more. It's truly horrific. That's all we've got time for today. Do join me, same place, same time again tomorrow for We Need to Talk About on GB News at 2 o'clock. Coming up next, of course, it's The Briefing with Darren McCaffrey, but first, it's time for the weather forecast. Bye-bye.
Hi there. A bright but windy day in the far north with showers for northern Scotland. Cloudier further south with some outbreaks of generally light rain and drizzle associated with this cold front as it clears south. And it's in between this cold front and the warm front there across southern parts of the UK where we've got a lot of cloud and some outbreaks of light rain and drizzle. But to the north, brighter skies, tight isobars there across the far north of Scotland. So for the likes of Caithness, Sutherland, Orkney, 55 to 65 mile per hour wind gusts. So wind warning in force because of weakened structures. Could be some further impacts following the storms at the weekend. Otherwise, a breezy day to come for northern parts of the UK, some sunny spells, a few showers in the far north of Scotland, much cloudier further south, where it will be mild at 11 or 12 Celsius. We keep the cloud across southern areas overnight. In fact, there'll be thicker cloud pushing in from the west as the night goes on, some more persistent rain into Northern Ireland for a time, western parts of northern England, as well as western and southern Scotland. Showers continue across the Northern Isles, and for Shetland, they'll be falling as sleet and snow overnight. But further south, drier with some breaks in the cloud. However, for the vast majority, it is a mild night. That is away from Shetland, where it will be cold. Cold air continues there for Shetland as we start off tomorrow, but otherwise a lot of the cloud across the UK remains. Further outbreaks of light rain and drizzle for Northern Ireland, western Scotland, as well as parts of northwest England. But drier and brighter further south. Some sunshine coming through, and with a lighter breeze, it will feel fairly pleasant in that sunshine. Temperatures above average, 10 to 12 Celsius for the vast majority. Into Wednesday evening, and we'll see the outbreaks of light rain and drizzle become heavier and more persistent across the north and northwest of Scotland, staying damp for northern parts of the UK through the night, but drier further south, a lot of cloud cover, so a mild start once again on Thursday. Again, it's going to be damp in the north and west on Thursday, brighter skies follow on Friday.
Hello there, I'm Eamon.
And I'm Isabel.
And you're watching the GB News digital stream across the United Kingdom.
And around the world.
If you're here in the UK, you can also watch us on your TV screen. GB News is Freeview channel 236.
On Sky, we're channel 515.
626 on Virgin Media.
Just remember, you might need to retune your TV to watch the channel.
Yeah, and if you are doing that, find out more about retuning by going to gbnews.uk.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon.
And Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
A very good afternoon. Welcome to the Briefing PM, your fix of all the latest political news, debate and analysis here on GB News. I'm Darren McCaffrey, and here's what's coming up over the next